everyone, we are not in Facebook or in the Food 52 offices. We are at Prop Workshop and we're here with Meathead. Thank you so much for coming by.
This is fun, my second time.
Second time on Facebook Live. So, Meathead has this awesome book, which is kind of the Bible to me, really, the whole thing. New York Times best-selling book, and he's going to show us kind of the Bible, the king of holiday, I would say.
Yeah.
What are we doing today?
All right. Well, we're gonna talk about holiday roasts, and we'll show you some of the things I like to do with a prime rib roast. And we'll take questions, and we can talk about any old roast or any old holiday meal, anything kind of meat related. Although I do some side dishes.
I was going to say, should we talk about tofu? I don't know.
What do you know about tofu, Meathead?
I can grill it.
All right, well, I'm going to let you go at it.
Thanks so much to Food 52 for having me back. I kind of feel like it's our second date, which means that the first date worked out all right. What we've got here is the most luxurious, wonderful piece of beef. It's called the prime rib roast, and it comes from the beef primal, and that's this muscle along here with the ribs right underneath. And there are different grades. USDA has a grading system, so they're not all prime rib. It's called prime rib roast because it's the primal, which is the large chunk of meat it comes from, but you can get it made from USDA Prime, you can get it from USDA Choice or USDA Select, and this looks to be a USDA Choice, which is a really good piece of meat, really flavorful. And this is a 3-bone rib roast. 7-bone is the full rib roast, and they're not cheap, but it's really a great celebratory holiday type of piece of meat. And I do it differently than most folks, which probably won't surprise any of you who visit AmazingRibs.com, our website, or who've read my book. There's a good reason why I do it this way, and I'm going to show you how I do it. And you can leave your questions, and Allie and Gabriella here are going to feed them to me as we go, and just interrupt me as we go, and we'll just ramble.
You ready for the first one?
Oh, we have one already.
We've got our first question from Mike, and he said, how long should you let a prime rib roast rest before carving, and how do you keep it from getting cold? A foil tent doesn't really seem to keep it warm.
You know, okay, you went right for the most difficult question. Way to go, pal. Thanks a lot. This is one where I do a lot of things differently, but it's really easy to understand. My veering from the custom wisdom on this is very controversial. I say serve meat hot. I have never ever seen valid research, both lab research or kitchen research, that shows that there is any good reason to rest meat. They talk about redistribution of juices, but the water in meat is 70% water. And most of the juices in meat is water. Some of it is from fat that's rendered. Some of it is from collagen that is melted and turned into gelatin. At low temperatures like this, there's not a lot of collagen melting. That's why you want a tender piece of meat. We'll cook this to 130, which is medium rare, which is most tender. The water in meat is trapped within the fibers or between the fibers, and it doesn't run away from the heat. It can't go anywhere. There are no super highways in here. In fact, if you've ever grilled a steak, you know that when you put it on the surface, you can hear it sizzle. Juices come out of the top, come out of the sides, all over. I think you serve it hot. There's been some research, and I've done some, that shows that if you cut into a really hot piece of meat, there's a little bit more juice coming out of the meat if you cut into it right away than if you let it rest 5 minutes. 5 minutes. But you know what? Most of the experiments I've seen, people start chopping up the meat and measuring the juice that comes out. When you sit down to eat a piece of meat, you cut off a little bit of the corner. You don't chop it up into 1,000 pieces. So there's very little loss of water, and it's not lost. You soak it up with the meat on the end of your fork. It goes into the mashed potatoes. I just don't think there's any real good reason yet. And in fact, I've been in correspondence with the people at Texas A&M University, and I am offering to underwrite research to find out once and for all if there's any damn reason to rest meat from a scientific standpoint. So, answer your question, take it off, serve it hot. People want to see hot, smell fragrant, and it will cool off on your plate fast enough. The juices aren't lost. No juices will be left behind. You'll mop them up with the meat on the end of the fork. So,
Meathead, do you heat up your dinner plates first?
do I heat up the dinner plates? That's a nice thing to do. I like that. You got to be careful with the kids. Kids can burn themselves on a hot plate. But yeah, people like hot. I mean, is there more exciting than a sizzling steak? So yeah, a hot dinner plate is nice. Normally, I don't do it. Frankly, I must admit. I'm juggling 16 other things, the vegetables, the meat, and everything. But if you can warm a dinner plate, that's a real nice touch. You know, the Japanese have a method of cooking for guests. They call it kaiseki. And they cook the same meal that they would cook on a Tuesday night. But when you cook kaiseki, you take extra care. You make sure all the pieces are cut perfectly. And that's a form of kaiseki. You serve it on a hot plate. It shows respect for the guest. It's something extra special. And I like to say it's not so important what's on the plate as what's in the chairs. And so show respect for your guests.
I love that. Now Kathy's asking, how big a piece do you buy? For example, 6 people. Like, how many ribs should you have on your piece of meat?
Yeah, okay. General rule of thumb. Now, a lot of it has to do with time of day, how many appetizers, how many side dishes, how much drinking is going on, how many adults, how many children. My rule of thumb, regardless, is half a pound per person of raw material. You're going to get about 20 to 30% shrinkage, depending on what temperature you cook the final product to. So you're going to end up with less than a half a pound of raw product. And also you're going to have loss. I mean, there's bone, there's fat. So I start with roughly half a pound per person and go from there. And if you make extra, hey, wrap it up in foil and everybody goes home with some leftover. Nobody's going to complain about taking extra.
Makes for a good sandwich the next day.
You work sandwiches the next day, absolutely. Okay, let me show you what we've got here. We've got this 3 bone, you know, Gabrielle, you bought this. Do you recall what it weighed?
About 6.6 pounds.
About 6 pounds, okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you how I do it. It's different. Now, sometimes the butcher will remove the bones and then tie it back on. But we've had them leave it on here. And I'm just going to take the strings off right now. And I'm going to do a serious amount of butchery here. But you'll understand what I'm up to very shortly. We're going to take this and we're going to remove the bones. First of all, there is no flavor in the calcium of the bone. Everybody says that bone-in is more flavorful. That's true if you're going to do it in a stew, like a crock pot or something. The marrow of these bones here is chock full of flavor. That's where the blood is made. There's a lot of fat and other stuff in there. And if you put this in a crock pot full of liquid, water is a solvent. And water will pull that liquid and all that flavor out. So, I mean, that's why we wash our hands with water. We wash our cars with water. But when you're roasting this in the oven, there's nothing going to pull that out. And on the outside, it's calcium. And it's thick calcium. There's no flavor in calcium. And what happens is this bone acts like a heat shield. So when you're roasting it, let's say we take this whole thing right here and throw it in the oven and roast it exactly as it is. Heat's going to enter from these sides. Now here's a really important concept. I know it's obvious, but a lot of people don't think of it this way. The warm air in your oven or in your grill cooks the outside of the meat. But the outside of the meat cooks the inside of the meat. You heat the outside of the meat and the energy gets stored in the exterior. And it moves slowly because it's 70% water, maybe 8 or 10% fat. There's protein and other things in here. And it moves very slowly through the meat. So the outside stores energy. So you want to actually cook it at a low temperature so that it moves gently through. And we'll get to cooking temp in a little bit. But I want to get this bone off of here so that the meat won't be impaired by this thick heat shield. And it's just like the space shuttle. You've got this heat shield of bone. Now, look at that. You can roast this baby just by itself, and that's a pretty nice meal for one person on a 3-bone. There's plenty of meat in there, or throw that in your stock pot. And you can make a magnificent soup or gravy. So,
You know, we have a couple of questions. Judy's saying she usually leaves her roast in the fridge for 24 hours. Does it really help doing that?
putting it in the fridge for 24 hours?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand. Keeping it in the fridge for 24 hours?
Yeah, can you clarify on that question?
I mean, you want to keep it chilled. You don't want to. You don't
Maybe
want
it's
to take.
frozen first.
Oh, it's frozen.
I'm not sure. I'm just guessing. We'll wait until Judy gets back to us. And Carrie's asking how many people will this piece of meat that we're working with serve? We talked a little bit about it.
Yeah, roughly. What did you say? This was a 6-pounder.
Yeah.
I count on a half a pound per person. And that'll probably have left over because already we've removed 3/4 pound of bone. Now we're going to remove the fat. Now this is another thing that flies in the face of conventional wisdom. But you have this thick fat cap on here. Meat is 70% water. Fat is oil. Oil and water don't mix. Now the fat in here, the marbling inside the meat, that will melt. That makes juiciness. This fat will not get into the meat. It cannot get into the meat. There's no way. I mean, I've done the tests, we've proven it. What it can do is it'll melt off. But the problem is when you serve this, let's say we're going to cook it like this and we're going to slice off slices. The first thing is people are going to cut off the fat. And when they do, all the rub, all the spices are going to come off with it. So I get rid of the fat. I want to go right down to the meat. So I'm going to be fairly draconian here. Now I'm moving quickly, but I am getting rid of this fat cap. Again, that'll go into the stock pot.
Meathead, we got clarification from Judy. She said uncovered, not frozen. She was told that the outside dries out and helps seals in the juices.
Yeah, it will actually. That's a good question, Judy. Yeah, what you want to do even more than that is try to salt it a day or two in advance. Salt is different than anything else on your spice rack. Salt is the magic rock. Salt is sodium, chloride. 2 atoms, that's all. When they get on the surface of the meat, the water comes out and melts them, and they go deep into the meat. But garlic, sugar, onion, rosemary, they're all huge molecules. They cannot enter the meat. They're a surface treatment, just like a sauce. They'll make a wonderful crust, but they can't go into the meat. So if you're going to get for Christmas, for example, I take delivery on my roast, and I get a big 7-bone roast because I'm feeding a bunch of people. And I'll salt it on the 23rd. I'll trim it as I've done so far. I've taken off the bone, I've taken off the fat cap, and I'll get a little more of this surface fat off here. I want the meat to show because I'm going to put seasoning on this. I'm going to salt it, and I'm going to put a spice rub that I have all kinds of good stuff in there. I call it my cow crust, or I have 2 of them, a big bad beef rub. But I use garlic and onion and rosemary and such. And so I'm going to get most of this fat off the surface so that the seasoning can be in touch with the meat, because I want to build the crust. So Judy, was that her name?
Yes.
Judy, what I like to do is I like to take this, trim it up a couple of days in advance, and salt it so that the salt has time to migrate. Salt does 2 really important things. Salt will, what's called denature the proteins. It deforms the shape of the proteins in the meat so that they actually can hold on to moisture better. And it also amplifies flavor without altering it. Garlic alters the flavor. and other spices alter the flavor. But salt does not alter the flavor, it just amplifies it. So I put salt on there a couple of days in advance, leave it in the fridge, and now if you're at a restaurant, you can't leave it uncovered. That's against the health laws. Because they're really worried about cross-contamination. They're worried that the meat will come into contact with vegetables, and meat is a source of potential microbial contamination, so you want to treat it with respect, and you don't want it touching vegetables and other such things. But if you're very careful at home, you can let your meat sit in the fridge overnight or a day or two in advance, and let that salt penetrate. As far as the rub, the seasoning, that can go on anytime just prior to cooking. I sprinkle it on there often, and you can either wet the surface with water or oil. Actually, much to my surprise, I always used to say use oil because I thought the spices would dissolve better in oil, but in fact they dissolve better in water. I was quite surprised to do some experiments and discover that spices dissolve better in water. And so I'm just now cinching it up, and then the next step is I'm going to cinch it. You see, I've removed the bones and the fat. I want to cinch it so that its shape is cylindrical. Oh, didn't quite give myself a lot of string here.
Meathead, we have a couple questions just going back to the salt. Someone wanted to know if you were talking about using coarse salt.
Coarse? I use kosher salt because it's really easy to pick up with my fingers and sprinkle. And the rule of thumb is a ½ teaspoon per pound. And in the case of this roast, you see it's getting fairly uniform in thickness. You don't have to worry about it. But like in a turkey, you want to put it heavier on the thick pieces, lighter on the thin pieces. Leg of lamb, you got a big fat end on one end and it tapers. But roughly, rule of thumb, ½ teaspoon of kosher salt per pound. If using regular table salt, half that amount, ¼ teaspoon. Table salt has a smaller grain size than kosher salt, so it has less air, and so it's essentially twice as concentrated. I like kosher salt, but folks, one of the greatest scams out there right now is this organic salt game, or sea salt. I like large grain salt, particularly as a finishing salt. But folks, all salt is sea salt. All salt comes from the ocean. All salt is sea salt. Now, a lot of table salt has iodine added or anti-clumping agents, and you can probably live without those, although we need iodine. So that's why they put it in there in the first place. Years ago, people were having problems with their thyroids, and so they were putting iodine in salt. You don't need it necessarily anymore if you've got a well-balanced diet or if you take a daily vitamin tablet. But, you know, paying a lot of money for expensive, fancy sea salt, not something I do normally. I do have some nice sea salts, big flaky salts, which I like to put on the surface as a finishing, you know, like you would on a pretzel. Because like when you serve a steak, a splash of big flake of salt, it gives you a burst in your mouth. But right now we're talking about salting it so it penetrates. So this is wet surface. What I'll do is I'll just take a little water on my hands and moisten the surface and hit it with the salt, and it'll get in. Now you see what I've done here is I've made a cylinder, and that means it's the same distance from all edges to the center. So heat can penetrate evenly. When you had that bone on here, it was oblong. And what happens when it's oblong, you know how like when you do lasagna, the corners get really crusty? Because the heat's entering on the corners from all four sides. So when you take the regular roast, as you got it from the store with the bones attached, and it's all oblong shaped, you're going to get uneven cooking. Now, I've got a roasting pan here only for one reason, because I hate them. And this goes for beef and turkey. What happens is if you put the roast, now ignore this strap, put the roast in here, what happens? there's plenty of heat from above, warm air circulating from above. But even if you've got a rack in here, say you've got it on a V-shaped rack, these sides are going to block the heat. And often you put water or vegetables down under here and they're wet. So you may have 250, 300 degrees air up above, and down below, it's cool. It's down at the 200, 250, 275. So it's not cooking evenly. What I do, now I normally like to cook it on the grill. If you cook it on the grill, then there's more room for pie inside. And rule 1 in my house is save room for pie. Now I like to cook it on the grill because you get some smoky flavor, and smoke is a wonderful herb or spice that you just can't get off your spice rack. And when I cook it on the grill, I'll put this under the grill grate and the meat on top. Now air circulates all around and it cooks evenly all around. At home, what I'll do, or indoors, is I'll put this on the top rack of my oven and put the roasting pan down below. And then I'll put some foil around the roasting pan. So again, we have hot air circulating evenly all around, and this tubular shape now allows it to penetrate evenly on all sides. And you get really even cooking. Now, the next thing you can do if you want, see all this trim? Threw it in the pan, throw some onions, some carrots, some celery, some beef stock if you want, or some water, a splash of red wine, and you make a stock in this pan underneath the roast. It drips, you get fat and juices dripping in here, and then just before this is done, you take this pan out, strain it, and now you have this wonderful beef stock, which you can, if it's not strong enough, put it in a saucepan, reduce it on the stovetop, add flour if you want a thick gravy, or just leave it thin, and it's just wonderful. Or you can just save that and make a soup for another day.
Does anyone ever do that with chicken?
Yeah, you can do that with chicken. A lot of people like to put the chicken right in the pan, but again, when you do that, you don't get the heat from underneath. And when you cook a turkey or a chicken whole, the heat doesn't really penetrate the inside. That's why spatchcocking is such a great idea, or butterflying the chicken or turkey, because you can now get the inside. When you butterfly it, you cut up the backbone and you flatten it out, and now the inside, the cavity, which is usually tan, can brown. And brown is flavor. Brown is beautiful. Brown is something we want as much as we can get of it. So when you spatchcock a chicken, and I'll do the same thing with a chicken. I'll put it on the top rack or on the grill, and then the pan underneath, and collect those juices. Now also on a chicken, what I'll do on my chicken is I'll put it on the rotisserie sometimes instead of spatchcocking it, and then I'll put Brussels sprouts, potatoes, carrots, and onions down here, put a little water in there, and as that baby rotates, it drips down in. The water steams and melts the vegetables, and then as it evaporates, just before I'm done, I'll give it a little hit of honey or some seasoning, and you'll get these roast vegetables underneath. It's fantastic. So I really am a huge fan of cooking the two together, the meat and the vegetables, but separately. I want this above the pan, not in the pan. So, we've salted it the night before. We've got rid of the bone. We got rid of the fat. Mm-hmm. We've made it a cylinder so it can be cooked evenly from all sides. And then just before cooking, we give it our spice rub, and then we're ready to cook. And we'll talk about cooking temps.
Is there too early to salt your meat?
Pardon?
Is there a time that would be too early to salt your meat?
Too early to what?
Salt the meat.
Salt the meat? Oh. No. I mean, you don't want to leave it sitting uncovered in the fridge for more than a few days, 3-4 days. But no, you can salt it 2, 3, 4 days in advance, and it takes a while for the salt to penetrate. So I typically, like for Christmas dinner, we'll salt it up on the 23rd.
Okay, good to know.
Is there any concern about having the roast stick on the grates of the oven?
Yeah, it'll stick. The question is if you're going to put it on that top rack, it's going to stick to the grate, isn't it? Yeah.
But it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, it actually, I mean, it's like anything else. It lets go.
Right.
The protein will stick. And that's, even though the rack may be shiny and look smooth, it's not. It's got pits. And so it'll stick, but it eventually will let go. And you're going to have to clean the rack.
Right.
But it shouldn't explode and spatter all over the place. It'll drip. But that comes to the next question. We'll talk about cooking temps in a minute. Let's see what other questions we got. But we're going to cook them at a low temp, which will keep the spattering down. Escapee.
Yeah, sometimes I hear that people like wrap their oven racks with foil to prevent the sticking situation and like making the cleanup easier. Have you ever heard of that?
Question is wrapping the interior of the oven with foil to
Or
make...
like the oven rack, the grates, right? Wrapping that part with foil, like when you make...
Oh, wrapping the grate with foil.
Yeah.
I suppose you could, but you know, now you're changing the airflow in there. The grates allow air to flow through in between. If you want to protect the grate and make cleanup easier, go ahead and put foil there and then cut through so the air can continue. Remember, you've got this, we talk about convection ovens, but what all ovens are convection ovens. Convection is essentially fluid flowing through space. In this case, the fluid is air. But when you fry, it's also convection because the oil is flowing through the deep fat fryer. Convection ovens are just a regular oven with a fan. And sometimes they have an extra heating element with that fan. And that moves the air through, and it really speeds the cooking. And it's really great if you love crispy chicken skin. Convection ovens really, they dry the surface well. But your oven is a convection cooking device. And that means you don't want to interfere too much with airflow. Now I know we keep a pizza oven in our oven just because it's the easiest place to store it. And we've discovered that just leaving it in there alters the heating properties of the oven. So now we take it out a lot. If you're going to put foil over the rack and then put this on the rack, cut holes in the rack so the air will continue to flow. Otherwise, it'll hit the bottom of that foil and go down. And the whole idea is we want to envelop this in warm air, convection air flow. That's a beauty, isn't it?
Yes. So we have lots of questions about cooking temperatures. We have someone that wants to smoke their prime rib and wants to know how that's going to affect it.
Okay.
So we should probably start talking about cooking.
Yeah, okay. All right, let's talk about smoking it real quickly. Turkey loves smoke, but not too much. Pork loves lots of smoke. I think a little bit of smoke tastes good to me. Now we're dealing with personal preference. I like a little bit of smoke on my beef, but not too much. I've smoked beef roasts, you know, with heavy smoke, and I find it ponderous. I think the smoke flavor is a little too much. Love it on pork, not so much on pork, beef. So smoke is kind of like salt. You can always add it, but you can't take it away. Go easy on smoke. Smoke your roast. If you like it and you think you'd like more, then next time add more wood. But don't go crazy the first time and throw a lot of wood on that roast on the fire and smoke it real heavy because you may find the flavor too strong. Now, cooking temp. Here's another really important concept. A lot of cookbooks tell you to roast this baby start it at 500. And that's going to sear the outside and seal in the juices, and then you're going to turn the temp down to say 350. Well, first of all, we really know, absolutely, positively, guaranteed, without an exception, that searing does not seal in juices. These are not like little balloons, these muscle fibers, and they don't get tied off at the end when you hit them with high heat. So searing does not seal in the juices, but searing is crucial. Searing is flavor. Searing is something called the Maillard reaction. It's when the chemistry of the proteins and the reducing sugars on the surface of the meat get changed by the heat. And they get lots of new flavors. And think about it, the crust of this roast, the crust of the steak, toasted English muffin, roasted coffee beans. They all have more flavor than unbrowned or unmaillarded flavor. And it's called the Maillard reaction, by the way. A lot of chefs call it caramelization. Caramelization is what happens with sugar. There's not much sugar here. It's technically Maillard reaction, but that's just, being technical. So you want that brown surface as much as you can get it. So people want to sear it, and that's important. But when you do that, remember I said heat cooks the outside of the meat, and then the outside of the meat cooks the inside? Think of this like a capacitor. It holds energy. So you're going to load up the exterior with energy, and then it's going to slowly work its way down in. If you put a lot of energy, 500, 450, 400, 350, into the surface of this meat, it's going to cook the surface and brown it. But if you slice it open when you're done, you'll see the outside is dark brown, gorgeous crust. And then right below it, there's a layer of brown. And then right below that, there's a layer of tan. And below that, there's a layer of pink. And finally, you got a little bit in the center that is red, and that's medium rare. We know medium rare is the most tender, the most juicy. Now, a lot of people like it well done, and I think a reason for that is they think that the juices are blood. They're not blood. All the blood has been removed during the slaughter process. There is no blood. Think about it. Your blood and cow blood are the same, very much the same. They're thick, they're black, they coagulate when they get in the air. What do the juices look like when they come out of a steak or out of a roast? They're thin, they're watery, they're pink, and they're runny. It's water. It's pink water. And it's gotten pink by a protein called Meathead Goldwyn. So it's basically water. Remember I said it's 70% water. There is no blood. So you don't have to fear red color in the meat. You're not eating blood. It's just pinkish meat. And it's most tender when it's pinkish to red, and it's most juicy. As the meat gets darker in color, goes towards brown, the juices are bound up in the meat. They also evaporate, and the meat is drier. And that's why we hear anecdotal stories about you go to a fancy steakhouse and you order a steak, USDA prime, expensive steak, and you ask for it well done, and the chef reaches out and gets an El Cheapo steak, and that's what you get. He doesn't want to waste his guy. I don't know if that's true. We hear those stories. But you really are getting less of what you're paying for when you overcook. Roughly 130, and that's another key concept. You don't cook with a clock. You cook with a thermometer. Now, see this baby here? It's about 4 inches thick. That air enters here, and it takes a period of time for it to get to the center. It takes if I cut 3/4 of a pound off the back of this roast, it's still going to take exactly the same amount of time to cook, even though it's lighter, because it's the same thickness. I haven't reduced the thickness. Now, if I peeled off a layer, it would cook faster. So it's not the weight that determines the cooking time. And a lot of recipes say, if it's a 10-pound roast, you cook it X number of minutes per pound. No, it's the thickness. And the only way you know when it's done is with a thermometer, and you cannot trust your oven. Your oven temperature is probably off by as much as 50 degrees. You need to use a meat thermometer. You need to probe the meat in the center and shoot for 130, that's medium rare. Now, if you want the most tender, the most juicy, you want it all medium rare. So the way you get that is you dial back the temperature. We cook too hot. We put the pedal to the metal. Dial it down. I like to go for 225. At 225, the heat gently works its way down into the center. Now, you may not get as dark a crust as you'd like. And you compensate for that by something that we call the reverse sear. Instead of searing it at the beginning and loading up the exterior with energy, which then works its way through during the cooking process and gives you overcooked meat on the outer edges, you sear it at the end. And on a grill, if you're doing it on a grill like I like to do, you lift the lid and you put it right over direct heat now, and you give it a sear for 3 or 4 minutes, and then you roll it and give it another sear, and you roll it and give it another sear, and you leave it this way so that as you roll it, the energy comes off the top. If you're doing it indoors, get your cast iron frying pan and put it in the cast iron frying pan and sear it on all sides on the surface. So you'll cook it to about 125 or 130 in the center, take it out, throw it in that hot pan, and sear it on the outside. Get that dark edge, even on these ends, all around, get that beautiful brown Maillard flavor, and then when you cut into it, it'll be medium rare or the same temperature, whatever your target is. 130 is medium rare, 130 to 135, 135 to 140 is medium, where it's a little more pink if you don't want it quite medium rare. But remember, it's not blood. Every time you call it blood, somewhere a bell rings and a teenage girl becomes a vegan.
Meathead, we have some questions about sous videing versus roasting prime rib.
Talk about the ultimate reverse sear. Sous vide. I do a lot of public speaking lately now that I've got a book on the market. And I am interested to see that a lot of people don't know what sous vide is. Probably different for your audience because you guys got some serious foodies. This is a really interesting cooking technique that's really coming into its own because the devices for cooking with sous vide are coming down in price. And there are several really good ones on the market, under $200 now. Can I mention brands?
Sure.
I'm a huge fan of the new one from Joule, Joule. It talks to your smartphone. I love it.
Yes. We have one of those in our office, actually.
Yeah, they're tremendous. It's like an old Boy Scout flashlight. It's a little tube. Does anybody know what a Boy Scout flashlight is? Thank you anymore. What you do is you'll take the meat and you put it in a plastic bag, lower it into a pot of water so that the water squeezes out the juices. Now you can use a vacuum sealer if you want, but you don't have to. And you just Ziploc the bag, and most of the air is out. And then you put this heating device, the sous vide machine, this Joule, or there's another one by Innova, several brands on the market, and you put it in the warm water, and it warms the water, and you set it to 130 degrees, medium rare. You can never overcook it. It goes up to 130 degrees. It can't go to 131 because the water is 130. It cannot be overcooked, and it takes forever for it to cook because it's a very gentle cooking now. At 130 degrees, it can take hours to cook a roast like this, like 5 hours, 6 hours. But it becomes really succulent and tender, unbelievably juicy. It has one problem. When you open the bag and you take it out, it is but ugly. It is tan all over. There's no brown. There's no sear. Searing comes from high temperature. So what you can then do is you throw it in a hot pan, just like we talked about, roll it around, get your good sear, or what I like to do, take it out to the grill. Fire up a charcoal grill or get your sear burner on your gas grill as hot as you can get it, lift the lid, and just put all the energy into one side. Rotate, energy, rotate, energy. You're not really cooking much of the interior. You're loading up the exterior with the energy, and as you rotate it, that energy comes off the surface. And you get the dark, beautiful brown sear, and it is so tender and juicy inside. It's a great technique. But for a roast, it can take, I'd say a roast like this, maybe 8 hours or more.
Okay, so it's a time commitment. We have a couple questions about cooking on pellet smokers.
Yeah, I love pellet smokers. Traeger is the most popular brand. I have a Mac, an M-A-K, not the computer, and I love them. They're tremendous. Pellet smokers work by cooking little pieces of sawdust that have been pressed into pellets. They look like if you broke a pencil into half-inch segments. That's what they look like, and they're just they burn and they create smoke, and you get a really nice, elegant flavor smoke. The pellet smokers are really, they call them grills, but they're really not good grills. They're really smokers. I mean, if you want to grill a steak, you really want hot energy. You want infrared heat, and pellet smokers are really convection heat. But I love using my pellet smoker. Again, shoot for around 225, and you may need to take it off and throw it over a hot charcoal grill just to sear the exterior.
Can I ask a question about reverse sear?
Yeah.
It seems like such an important technique to use. Could you use it? Could you reverse sear pretty much any kind of meat, or which would you not use it for?
I am a huge fan of reverse sear. I even reverse sear baked potatoes. I mean, the concept is, and I've touched on it, but let me dwell on it. You're putting energy into the surface of the food, whether it's a potato or meat. And that energy has to work its way down in. And if you use hot air, a lot of energy builds up. And so you get overcooked layers on the outside. But if you can dial back the temperature to a low temperature, then it cooks more evenly and more gently, but you don't get a sear. So you sear it at the end of the cook, not the beginning. Now, searing at the beginning is perfectly good if you're going to do something like in a crock pot, where you want to brown and you want to develop those flavors. That's called wet cooking. You're putting it in with a liquid, and it's a whole different process. This is roasting. This is dry cooking. On a grill, it's roasting. And so you can sear at the end, and when you do, you get more even on the inside, and you get your beautiful brown on the outside. And I mentioned baked potato. I'm kind of a grill guy, so I mean, I'll put potatoes on the grill, and I'll take a baking potato, big old russet, slice it in half, and I'll wet it, sprinkle it with salt. Salt will work its way down in. Sprinkle it with some seasoning, and I'll put it on the indirect side in the convection air portion of the grill. Divide the grill in half. You got a hot side and a not hot side, a flame and no flame. If you got a gas grill, you turn one burner on and leave the other burner off. Got a charcoal grill, you push all the charcoal to one side and you leave the other side void. And you cook most everything over here by convection. And then when it's time to sear, you move it over here. So for a potato, I'll roast it over here and I'll take it right up to 210. Boiling temperature is 212. I use a thermometer even on potatoes. I mean, if you want it crunchy, 207, 208. You want it tender and juicy and fluffy, 210 to 212. And you measure the temp, and when you're done, you move it over the hot side, and now you've got that wonderful crispy skin. And I eat my potato skin. Somebody in my family who's been married to me for 43 years doesn't. And it has caused many debates.
You can eat them.
I eat them. Oh God, yes. I love the taste and the texture. So you sear them at the end, and you get the nice crispy potato skins.
Do you recommend using a barbecue with infrared heaters to get the searing done? And is cast iron or steel grate better?
Two questions.
Yeah.
Yes, infrared burner or sear burner for a gas grill does great job of searing. Absolutely, that's what they're designed for. And I am not a fan of cast iron grill grates for a couple of reasons. They're just a pain to maintain. They rust. When you're done cooking, you have to let them cool off. Then you got to go out and oil them. If you forget to oil them, next time you go out, they're all rusty. Then you got to scrub them down. Plus, the metal heats up pretty fast, stays hot, transmits heat, and it makes grill marks. Now, grill marks are good. Grill marks are Maillard reaction. But the metal in a grill holds more energy than the air. Now, think about this. You heat up your oven to 225. Everything inside is 225, right? The air is 225, the grates are 225. You can put your hand in a 225 oven and hold it there for a minute. It's not that bad. Now put your hand on the side of that oven. When you come back from the hospital, you'll know that not everything that's 225 has the same amount of energy stored in it. Metal stores more energy than air. So you put your meat on a cast iron grate, and it's going to have a lot of energy, and it's going to sear marks into the surface. If I'm doing a steak, I want the whole surface brown. I want the whole surface covered with that Maillard reaction. I want all that flavor. If you just sear parts of it, you get these little cross hatches, and they're wonderful. But the spaces in between the cross hatches are undeveloped potential. They just don't have the flavor that the cross hatches have. So I actually prefer cheap, thin metal grill grates, and I turn them frequently so I can get as much browning all over as I can get. And incidentally, our friend, you guys I'm sure know Kenji Lopez-Alt over at Serious Eats. Kenji's done some really good work on this, proving that the more you flip a burger or a steak, actually the more juicy it is. Again, another old husband's tale bites the dust.
Yep. Great.
So can I ask you what, we went over prime rib, but what about some other great holiday roasts?
Yeah. How about a pork crown roast? Fun?
Yeah.
Same cut. There's two muscles here. This muscle here, we call it the eye of the ribeye, and that's the longissimus dorsi. Come here. Come here.
Allie's getting pulled back over here.
I'm taking notes.
Turn around. Turn around. That's this muscle, and you can feel it. It runs down your back. That's the longissimus dorsi, and it runs right down into your hips and up into your shoulders. And longissimus, the long dorsi on your back, the long back muscle. And that's the longissimus dorsi. But there's another muscle in here. See it? Runs around the outside. And that we call sometimes the rib cap, or the spinalis dorsi. This is the best muscle on the animal. Now, what I will often do on my Christmas roast, I hadn't planned on getting into this. Before I cinch this baby up, I will often peel that muscle off. It's easy to peel. See, there's a layer of fat right here? You can peel that off with your fingers. You don't even need a knife. You can peel that off. And it's like a salmon fillet. It's kind of tapers and thick and at one end and thin at the other end. And it's like Kobe beef. It's more heavily marbled than the eye of the ribeye. And a lot of people love the eye, and it's a great cut, but this muscle here, now for that I really sear it hot and fast because it's not too thick, but that's a really great muscle. So the question was, what about other roasts? And the pork crown roast is exactly the same as this. It's the longissimus dorsi. It often has, if you've ever bought a pork chop, you may have noticed two colors, a pale center and then a kind of a reddish wraparound. Same thing, that's the longissimus and the spinalis. And it has rib bones. And this, by the way, is where your ribeye steaks come from. See, I was demonstrating about thickness. I cut off an end here. I don't know if you came in late, but I cut off the slab here just to talk about the thickness. But that's a ribeye steak. This is where ribeye steaks come from. And the same thing with on a pork roast, the pork chop comes from there, the bone-in pork chop. Same muscle. And again, same concept. Pork, the USDA, the guys who work for the pork lobby must not be as good as the guys who work for the beef lobby. Because the beef lobby has gotten the USDA to tell us that we don't have to cook the heck out of the beef. But the pork guy, USDA still says minimum of 145 for pork. If you have never cooked a pork chop to 140 or 135, you've never tasted pork. Now, there's some safety issues here, and I got to walk a fine line. USDA wants us to be careful, and USDA wants us to be aware of food safety and temperature. And so they've given us a guide, and they've told us what a minimum temperature for cooking. And let's talk about maybe you're going to cook turkey for Christmas. They tell us to cook turkey and chicken to 165. At that temperature, that's the magic number that kills almost everything. All bacteria, all contaminants, all bad guys are killed at about 165 in 7 seconds. But if you cook it to 160, it takes about 2 minutes. You can cook it to 155, and I don't remember the exact time, 30 minutes maybe. It's time and temperature together. But USDA understands that that's getting really complicated, and it's hard to tell people all this, so they give us a number, 165. 145 for pork. But you can actually cook to a lower temp if you hold it at that temp for a little bit longer. And it's complicated. I've got the tables on AmazingRibs.com. You want to make sure you know what you're doing, and don't fiddle around. Don't go from USDA temps unless you've got a really good thermometer. And by golly, if you don't have a good digital thermometer, you need to go out and get one now. There's a whole bunch of good ones on the market. Spend about 30 bucks minimum. There's some cheapos for around 10 bucks. The dial thermometer that you have in your kitchen drawer is junk. Take it out and throw it out right now. Go out and spend 30 bucks. I'm a big fan of a product called the Thermopop from ThermoWorks. It's about 30 bucks. It's on their website. You can order it online. It's not on Amazon. And it reads precisely in 4 seconds. Precisely. Nothing will improve your cooking, indoors or out, than a good digital thermometer. It's the single most important tool, with the possible exception of a good knife. And frankly, I think I'd rather have a good thermometer than a good knife. So there is something for your Christmas list if you don't have one right now. In fact, why wait till Christmas? Get a good digital thermometer now. And if you're not sure about the brands, AmazingRibs.com, I actually have an electrical engineer who tests thermometers to make sure that they do what the manufacturer says. And we rank them. We give them ratings, gold, silver, bronze, metals. So you can go check our website. If you're in a store and you're looking at one, you can pull it up on your smartphone. But get a good digital thermometer. It will improve your cooking overnight.
All right. Awesome.
Other roast, about 30 seconds more. Lamb.
Yeah.
Yeah, leg of lamb. Mm-hmm. Leg of lamb is a really festive thing. And that too, you treat just like beef, about 130 to 135, maybe 140. The problem with leg of lamb is it tapers. It's fat on one end and skinny on the other. So you're going to have some overcooked. But leg of lamb is a great festive piece of meat. And I'll tell you, if you put me equidistance between one of these and a leg of lamb, I might die of starvation trying to decide which one to eat. If you've never had lamb, and I hear from this all the time, I don't like lamb. Did you just shake your head? Are you one of them?
No, I hear this.
You hear it too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just haven't had a good one.
Yeah, they've never had it done right. Mom stewed it, and it came out gray, and it wasn't lamb, it was mutton, and you've just got, go to a good restaurant, and they order lamb chops, loin chops, or actually, the rack of lamb is this exact same cut. It's the rack of lamb. It has the rib bones and the longissimus on it, and it's cooked medium rare. And if you love beef, you will absolutely adore a great rack of lamb. And that's really fun, festive food.
And you cut it and you cook it the same way?
Well, it's a thinner piece of meat.
Yeah.
So actually what I like to do with lamb racks is I cut them into steaks, 2 bones wide.
Yeah.
And then I'll snap one bone off so it's a lollipop with a steak. And then I grill those over high temperature. Yeah, those are good. Any more?
I think we got through all of the
Right.
questions.
Really?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's time to get roasting on some of this prime rib.
Get out of here before we get any more.
Yes.
This was fun.
Thank you so
You
much.
have such
Meathead.
a knowledgeable, educated, inquisitive audience. I
Yeah.
love you guys. I love your audience. Food 52 is really a great website.
We love having you.
Yes, thanks so much for stopping by, Meathead. I hope everyone gets inspired for some kind of roast to make for the holidays.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.